Good morning, Mary and other distinguished guests. It's always a pleasure to speak to India. But on this one occasion, I'm not too sure whether I'm the qualified person in terms of my ability to speak on a rather scientific topic like climate change. And I'll try my best. I'll try and see how bushfires and floods are in a way tackled in this part of the world, and also expose you to a couple of videos in between, and possibly the last one, where the scientific opinion itself is divided on the Australian climate change scenarios. One of the reasons why I say that there is a scientific opinion which is different from the average opinion that is just pushed into a lot of people around the globe is that floods and bushfires and some of these natural calamities are a result of climate change. But in Australia, there seems to be a thinking also that for the last 40,000 years, or even perhaps more than that, it has been a very, very arid climate for most of the region, very, very dry, and also very, very wet in some parts of Australia. And whether some of these theories that are talked about as climate change are applicable or not, I leave it to all those very distinguished speakers who were there in the last 2 days to possibly talk about those issues. I'm a humble social worker, and I don't think I ought to be actually involved in something like this. But however, the Nazareth School of Social Work, the college, and Professor Mary Angeline and others are very, very dear to me in terms of their commitment to social work, community development. And they've always made it a point to see that somewhere or the other I could be included. And this time, even if I'm not included if I'm not making a lot of sense to you, I obviously owe you an apology, and I'll give it to you straight away in the beginning itself. So my lecture will be around climate impacts on our lives in Australia, and I'll try to see the case of bushfires and floods, how this has shaped part of our Australian climate and partly how we basically face it. Somewhere on the YouTube, you might even find a lecture of mine on coping and resilience, particularly related to the Australian situation around floods and fury, nature's fury. And that was one of those social work oriented lectures that could be complemented or supplemented around this particular view that you'll be hearing. But at this time, when I'm parading to you, the slides that I'm parading to you belong to a very scientific collation, and I have acknowledged them. And even the material that I'm utilizing here does belong to the scientific community. So with malice towards none, I would like to begin my Ernst lecture today, and hopefully you will have something to understand as to how we see it in this part of the world, and try to get an idea as to what's actually happening. Okay, so basically, Australia has experienced a 1 degree increase in temperature since 2000. That's what the scientists say. The climate change develops a pace by itself. And there has been successively bad fire seasons, each one worse than the last. And the last one was pretty sad. And the length of fire season sometimes increases from 1 to 2 weeks and sometimes even 3 to 4 weeks. And there are still fires going on, although the climate has changed in most of the states within Australia at this point of time. It's difficult to manage fire, particularly when we have so much of bushland. Anyone who has astute interest in Australian situation will obviously look through the geography and the terrain of Australia, and you would find a large amount of our land has bush and very limited amount of people who live there. You would know that it is essential for any maintenance of climate that people must live there in order to maintain. Habitat specialists feel expansion of urban population into bushland areas may also be increasing the calamities. Sorry, the climate change has also given me, a climate change is basically for me a very simply season change gives me a little bit of cold and uh, not flu symptoms, thank God, but sore throat. So you'll have to bear through my lecture and thank my providence at this point of time. I'm also going to use some videos to assist me and to uplift this particular lecture. So there is this expansion of urban populations into bushlands. That means in urban areas, lots of people are going away to the bush. So what does that mean? It means that there could be hazards also caused by human beings, and is also the other way around, that if people who live in bush aren't equipped to preserve themselves in enduring any kind of man-made fire or anything else or the other, it obviously also affects the bush. So people from cities and retiring to bushlands, Arcadian settings, cashed up, healthy, they are bringing urban evolved expectations of what local service providers should be capable of. In other words, they go from the urban area to rural area and they expect the rural areas and the really bush areas to also serve them. And it's not there. The infrastructure isn't there at all. There is no awareness or little interest in natural hazards because they have not known that. Whereas if you look at rural societies which had rivers around, which had, which had the natural environment around, they knew what floods would be, they knew what fire would be, and they would always have people and their volunteers to actually be taken care of. So this kind of artificial movement that we find in Australia of people moving to bushland to make a beautiful, it's almost like a holiday home, and thinking about, in fact, staying there and coming back to the city once in a while to buy a few things for consumables and go back, also do face difficulties. Now you can look at the way they're constructing. The house itself is constructed in a way, it isn't generally a brick home, it's generally with what we call brick veneer or largely wooden frames and everything else. That's one of those issues too. Anyway, we will leave the property at the time. Most of these people will leave the property at the time of fire rather than stay and defend. That's also unfortunate thing. Whereas if it is a rural area, then you know when something is going on to the last breath, people will be going inside the house, picking up grandfather's photographs or something or the other, certificates and everything else, and they don't come out just with the bare a glass of water or something or the other. They like to preserve as much as they can. So there's a big difference in a way between the bushland culture probably in Australia and also possibly within the with the rural areas. So the growing Australian cities, doubling of the urban and rural interface, that's increasing a lot. It's also fueled by increase in population, immigration, and cheaper housing. And more recently, in the COVID-19, lots of people have also been thinking in terms of, do we say stay in the city with so many people and overcrowding, or do we move out to the rural areas and possibly stay, there's a lot of social distancing which naturally gets offered. That's a big debatable issue, but it is one of those things, considerations in a way. Under 10% of population live in truly rural areas and mostly live in cities or in the fringes as far as Australia is concerned. So that's another thing that you probably need to understand when you're trying to look at the Australian tapestry. The fire and emergency services no longer can rely on younger volunteers. And another interesting thing, in as far as Australia is concerned, is we have a huge volunteer force. I don't know if there is anyone who has never volunteered in Australia if he is an Australian citizen. I have always been volunteering, and of course, for the last 30 years that I have been here. So you would find pro bono work, just voluntary work in Australia is just so common. In fact, a quarter of our government business is on voluntary basis. The government collapses if there are no volunteers. And anything that you talk about, there are volunteers. You go to the hospital, you find volunteers. You go to anywhere, any situation, you find volunteers. So that social consciousness which is there is an important element of the Australian psyche and Australian life. So, with fire and emergency services, can no longer rely on the flow of young volunteers who are trained and coming over, because if they, it's also becoming how long there is a situation where people can't draw their coping or their own resilience from a reservoir of their own. And I would actually also ask you at some point of time, if you have time, to look at some of the other videos that I did talk about on coping and resilience, in from an Indian case study, particularly the Bombay floods case study, which will be a very important case study from the point of view of social work. That's also on the YouTube, and you can look it up. Young people moving to cities and coastal areas is kind of an issue, because what happens is they leave their older parents away, and they do obviously want to go towards places where they get jobs and also places where they comfort. The changing ethnic composition with changing attitudes and expectations, naturally. The urban areas, there was some kind, immigration department also has sometimes a view that if we are getting refugees and immigrants from rural societies, third world countries, maybe they are better off placed in rural areas. Now that's a reasonable, kind of a hypothesis. But what seems to be happening is the rural climate and the bush climate of ours vis-a-vis the bush climate of the third world countries, and also the agricultural patterns and the agricultural professions, if at all, if they do belong to, is obviously a different experience altogether. And moreover, I think most people who are migrating from the third world are not wanting to migrate to another rural area, another bushland, and then start looking at, putting out the fires or fighting the floods. They're coming to Australia because they want to give the best education to their children. They want to prosper, and they believe prosperity possibly is more in towns, in cities, and obviously mega cities. That's the way. Anyway, there are hypotheses on both the sides, and there are arguments on both the sides, what to do, what not to do. Once again, as I said, that there is a social science ambience and framework that comes from me rather than a scientific framework, and in comparison to the scientists who have spoken the last 2 days. So local fire services have closed doors, relying on distant services, because what's the use of a local fire service when there's an engine and there's no engine operator? There's also a volunteer burnout. How long will volunteers work? Any country, for that matter, does face situations like that. I guess it's the same thing. Farmers walking off the land, decline in yields and quality of food production, reduction in water for irrigation, absentee farming. It's a major issue. They're somewhere in the city, they leave it off to somebody or the other. The presence of only when seasons are good, lack of local support to suppress fires. These are some of our, issues as well. Now, abandoned bushlands. This is another issue that timber industry and other economic activity is absent in native bushlands. If there was an economic activity, probably there would be people. We just have so much of nature, which is not really, from an economic perspective, not very productive. But from a ecological perspective, yes, nobody wants to see that such a bushland is basically reduced. And there are ecological reasons why people obviously talk towards that. There are budget restraints, limit the skilled workforce required to work in ecology and those kind of areas for a long time. Not many people. It's you can't fancy all your life to become a bush researcher. You would. I mean, there are a few people who might do it, but then that also requires fancy sponsorships for them to be around such research. Reduction in prescribed burning days. Yes, that's an important indication. There are days when, in order to even preserve the bush, what they tend to do is there are layers and layers of bush, which obviously, before it catches fire, there are days when they can do something about it. Increase in tree changes seeking compensations. Political pressure to avoid controversy, that's also there. I mean, don't underestimate the political pressure that comes out from Greens, from Labour, from the Liberal Party and everybody else. Many species moving to the edge of their own evolutionary range. In other words, there is decay and decomposition that does occur. Government does spend, I guess, big on the rotary wing fire fleets, and something, however, reduces budgets for other measures. Workforce vacuum creation, uh, because of elderly at this point of time. The baby boomers is a kind of terminology that we use in our country for those who are at this point of time in their probably. And emergency services and land agencies losing knowledge and capital, increase in productivity requirements mean fewer younger people are attracted towards the industry itself. And the Australian population itself is, in a way, um, moving towards a 26 million. Availability of water is also becoming critical. We've got beautiful rivers called the Murray River flows, which have reduced with salt increasing, with the obviously the onslaught and interaction with the sea. Fires in catchment areas significantly affect flows. And again, regrowth of the catchment is an issue by itself because you need to be there in order to see it. So you would find the elusive carbon balance debate that keeps coming up every now and then. And the ETS scheme has placed heavier than expected cost on energy producers. It is hoped that there would be some offsets through investing in forests. But what to invest in forests? Which forest? And what do you do with the existing bush? So you've got to recreate forests, and that forest has to be economically productive for some reason or the other. It needs to bring in timber. And debate on what the carbon emissions will due to are they due to wildfire or due to something else? conservationists and are unhappy about smoke from managed burns and implications for emissions. So there's always that sort of a debate that goes on in Australia. Right. The health impacts, certainly there are health impacts. Smoke from bushfires exacerbates ever increasing rates of asthma. Asthma is one of those major concerns in Australia in various parts of, all those lands which are around bush. Major new hospitals to deal with respiratory problems being demanded for regional areas, and that's an issue. Where I have 400 people, 40 people, 6 people make a village, and 30 people might make a town. So how do you expect in such huge, terrain with limited amount of people to serve all these things? So it's an issue. So it is what we would call, from a user pay perspective, it is increasing. While there is enough demand, there is also an expectation user pays more for that, and the public service system is almost negligible. In other words, most of the public systems have all been, kind of, I mean, probably they're overrated. So therefore, most of them have actually become, they've been outsourced. So basically, privatization has taken long back, taken, has taken over most of these things, and that's the only way the world is going to be coming up. So you don't expect much public sector. That'll be ridiculous to expect public sector to take care of everything. So that's the kind of a way in which when you talk about compensation claims, who pays for the compensation claims? The insurance companies. And who pays the insurance companies? You pay for the insurance company. Governments don't. There's a certain amount of thing that the governments can do. It's not like for anything that happens bad, you don't just go to the government and blame them, because they can't really control the way it is. Just as, today you are reacting on COVID, it isn't created by, India's prime minister or American prime minister, president, or an Australian prime minister. It's just there, and we need to work through some of those things. So basically, we also have a whole lot of indigenous population issue in Australia, and with that, in the northern Australia, dry season fires burn out, control emitting greenhouses gases, and damaging probably the prime grazing land in a way. But that's also very limited land out there. So there are programs which the government is trying to do. The community organizations look after themselves. And a good thing about the indigenous people is they do have their own community organizations which do look after. And they manage, setting up the fires when it is needed, and they also control the weeds and biodiversity in the hotter climate in that part of the world. So the breakdown of incident management process is a very, very complex thing. There has been death of firefighters, and increasing technical advances in fire trucks has taken place as well. There is this move towards understanding how Canada tries to do their own stuff, and we are trying to figure out whether we could buy a few of those planes in order to control our bushfires. I can tell you one thing: considerable amount of energy is spent, money is spent in organizing. Lots of inquiries as soon as something happens. There are big commissions. Commission here is not the commission as backdoor money. Commission is obviously a royal commission which inquires into the cause, whether it's man-made or what has happened, whether it's a negligence on behalf of agriculture department or the forest department, etc. So basically, the scenarios are realistic in Australia, and therefore the last video, of course, that you would be seeing today would also ask, which basically balances the scientific opinion, and I hope you will get the opportunity to look at that um, thing as well. Now, I will now ask you to watch a couple of minutes of news video on our Australian floods, and hope I'll catch up with you as soon as that video is over. Thank you.
It's now rained here non-stop for 9 days, and more is expected. 18,000 people have already been evacuated from their homes. That number is expected to treble, with heavy rain forecast to continue for another 4 days. In Sydney, there's been up to 10 inches of rainfall. We haven't seen this sort of deluge for 6 decades. For residents, leaning on each other is key.
We couldn't have done it without our amazing friends and neighbours and people coming together, and the resilience of our community is strong. So the Hawkesbury has that. We've done this before, and floods and fire and whatever else it throws at us, we've got this.
All of this has been caused by an extremely rare weather event. A low pressure cell is sitting on land, running the length of the New South Wales coast, and it's colliding with a high pressure cell that's sitting south of us in the Tasman Sea. That collision is causing all this moisture to be continually drawn into the sky and dumped on us. A little more than a year ago, Australia was battling some of the worst bushfires in our history. Scientists say climate change is making extreme weather events like this more common. This time, it's rising water levels that have isolated communities. Rescue boats and helicopters are their only route to safety. 38 disaster zones have been declared in New South Wales alone, where the rainfall is being described as a 1 in 100-year event.
Oh, stay in there, mate. Stay in there.
And it's not just humans needing to be rescued. 10 million Australians are under some form of weather warning, but everyone is being urged to stay alert for the next 24 hours. David Richardson, Sky News, Sydney, Australia.
The last one that I intend talking about is also a video. Opinion has been different in Australia because they do think Australia, with over 40,000 years of existence, had this sort of semi-arid climate, also was prone to other natural disasters. So whether the climate change debate that is being continued in the more recent past is something which is sudden and affecting, or Australia will have to be seen in a different context. I'm not a scientist, but this looks to me a scientific opinion, and it's also given in layman's language. Please watch it and make your own judgment. In addition to that, after this video, if you have any questions, etc., which are around social sciences, social work, community development, etc., do give them to Professor Mary Angeline. At some point of time, I'll organize a separate talk to help you out. Thank you very much.
Let me show you how your taxes are not only wasted by our public broadcasters, but are used against you to distort public debate, to suppress facts, and to suppress robust debate, and to push their chosen political and ideological line on climate change. It's beyond a joke, really. As I've demonstrated to you before by reference to the science, the reports of the IPCC no less, and other sources, there's no way you can scientifically blame Australia's current drought on climate change. As you know, this is the land of droughts and flooding rains, and we've been hit by crippling droughts since European settlement, and obviously before that as well, and most drastically in the Federation drought. And we'll have to cope with severe droughts and floods so long as we exist on this continent. But the ABC is intent on making the link between climate change and the drought, even playing gotcha politics to force politicians to make a pointless concession.
I just want to test something with you there, because even then when I asked you about the changing climate, you said, well, the climate ever since we first tilled the soil. But the Treasurer who was out with you this week, he conceded that this drought is linked to climate change.
So do I.
Well, we accept the science around climate change. We accept that it is part of what is happening here today. Man is contributing to that, and the science has told us that.
So you accept that?
Totally, 100%. You can't run away. I live it. I mean, this drought in my electorate alone has been going for 8 years.
And to prove how misleading some of the public comments about the drought and climate change have been, I've shared with you this concise and strong assessment by one of the nation's leading climate scientists.
This may not be what you expect to hear, but as far as the climate scientists know, there is no link between climate change and drought. Now, that may not be what you read in the newspapers and sometimes hear commented, but there is no reason a priori why climate change should make the landscape more arid. And if you look at the Bureau of Meteorology data over the whole of the last 100 years, there's no trend in data. There is no drying trend. There's been a drying trend in the last 20 years, but there's been no drying trend in the last 100 years, and that's an expression of how variable the Australian rainfall climate is.
But at the national broadcaster, to borrow a phrase, it seems they can't handle the truth. They have ignored that assessment, not run it, pretended it wasn't made for weeks. But instead, their Media Watch show has slammed Sky News for running that analysis, and then they've organised and promoted a qualification of that statement from Professor Pittman. Have a look at last night's Media Watch.
So, does Professor Pittman actually believe there's no link? Well, no. Because last month, before Sky really piled on, a clarification was issued to say the professor had left out a crucial word.
And he fully admits he should have said there is no direct link between climate change and drought.
Yes, no direct link, but there's still a link, says Pittman, telling Media Watch.
Do hotter temperatures lead directly to higher evaporation and a higher risk of drought? No. But does global warming lead to changes in rainfall patterns that can lead to drought? Yes. This indirect link is clear.
And expanding on that link by telling us,
in some regions, this increases the risk of drought. In other regions, it decreases the risk.
That's the best the ABC can do, hey? They hang their case on pathetic semantics, the difference between no link and no direct link. They also talk about the chances of one way and the other. Let's listen again to Professor Pittman. This is the assessment the ABC ignored until they could find a way to qualify and change it.
This may not be what you expect to hear, but as far as the climate scientists know, there is no link between climate change and drought. Now, that may not be what you read in the newspapers and sometimes hear commented, but there is no reason a priori why climate change should make the landscape more arid. And if you look at the Bureau of Meteorology data over the whole of the last 100 years, there's no trend in data. There is no drying trend. There's been a drying trend in the last 20 years, but there's been no drying trend in the last 100 years, and that's an expression of how variable the Australian rainfall climate is.
Now, what the ABC also ignores is what the climate scientist Bible says about drought. The IPC Working Group on Drought says that the AR5 report stressed low confidence in global scale observed trend in drought, owing to a lack of direct observations, dependencies of inferred trends on the index choice, as well as difficulties in distinguishing long-term climate change from decadal scale drought variability. To be clear, throughout the IPCC reports, there are predictions that a warmer climate with its increased climate variability will increase the risk of both floods and droughts. Yes, more rain overall, more water in rivers, more floods, but also more droughts. Just little evidence of that happening yet, especially given these trends occur over centuries, not years. But you know that because I've mentioned it here before. Media Watch's Paul Barry, on the other hand, just cherry-picked some reports to support his droughts are getting worse campaign, lied to his audiences about me and others not checking the literature, and even pretended falsely that Professor Pittman's people had offered up new information. This is extraordinary behaviour from Barry. I mean, it's not as if he hasn't got anything better to do than to check a few facts. He is, after all, paid about $200,000 a year by taxpayers and has a full-time staff for this 15 minutes of television a week. That's about the same size staff he has to produce the staff he has to produce this 15 hours of television a week is about the same size as the staff here at Sky that produces 30 hours of live television a week for me, Peter Credlin, Andrew Bolton, Paul Murray. And this is the best they can do.
But seems Bolt, Kenny and Jones have blocked their ears because they're still treating Pittman's original quote as gospel, as we saw when Chris Kenny, for the second time in his show, played it to Labor's Matt Thistlethwaite.
The leading scientist in this area is Professor Andy Pittman from the University of New South Wales, and he makes very, very clear that there is absolutely no evidence that links the current drought to climate change. Matt Thistlethwaite, do you agree that you're wrong to try and associate bushfires and drought now with climate change?
Well, no, he did not agree, and no, he was not wrong. But why let the facts, or a clarification from the scientist you're quoting, spoil a good rant?
Well, he sure backtracked a bit. This is the climate campaign from Barry, isn't it? He's turning into the grandfather of Extinction Rebellion on the ABC, I think. He's got the ABC now blaming current bushfires and drought on climate change, ignoring the evidence and the science. And Barry pretends his program is as blind to rational thought. This program, he pretends, is as blind to rational thought and open debate as his is. Just for your information there, contrary to what Paul Barry and the ABC say, we contacted Professor Andy Pittman's office a week ago when we first reported his comments. We asked him for an interview and we were told he was too busy. We offered a follow-up interview the following day. No answer. Our offer remains open. We are confident that the professor can speak for himself rather than have his comments marshalled by the publicly funded thought police at Media Watch.